after what has been said, the next thing to go through is time. First, it is well to go through the puzzles about it, and through the external accounts, to see whether it is among the beings or non-beings, and then what its nature is.
Aristotle begins by inquiring into the nature of time. And the word here, phusis in Greek, is very important for Aristotle and connects to his idea of dynamics and the dynamic sense of movement within the physical world. But he's also looking at the question of the being of time. And the being of time is more connected to things like the intellect, unity, substance, attributes, relations, anything that we can judge with understanding and that is measurable and has limit. So when we ask about the nature of time, we open up to things like process and potentiality and the unlimited, and this idea of states and energeia and dunamis. These words mean activity, potential, potency, capacity. When we approach the question of time with respect to these dynamic aspects of reality, we see time as something unlimited. Now, he starts by saying that we should look at the external views, and this is a translation of the word exoteric or exoterike, and it's one of the first times we see this word used actually at all in Western history. And what it means here is this sort of common sense way that time appears to people in an average everyday way of relating to it. And what we find is that in this way of treating time, it will be paradoxical and it will produce inconsistencies when we try and think about it. And it's from this sort of exoteric or common sense way of viewing time that it has this paradoxical nature of possibly not existing. And Zeno, as we have seen, had already called into question the existence of movement. So Aristotle's goal in the physics is really not only to prove movement, but to prove the existence of the things related to movement, such as place and time, and to analyze the attributes of time and to show that they exist. And time will end up being, for Aristotle, something spiritual, mental, and intellectual, something that arises in the intellectual experience of our perception of movement. And just because time is spiritual or mental or intellectual doesn't mean that it is unnatural for Aristotle. So as we'll see, this actually really shows that for Aristotle, the intellect is a part of nature. And Aristotle also has a sort of developmentalist or emergentist view of time and of movement and the soul. So the experience of time is an emergent form existing in the soul, which arises from movement and from sensation. It follows them, he says. It follows motion, but at that same time, it is a reality of its own. It's not simply an epiphenomenon of movement. It is something intimately related to motion, but is also something that surpasses motion and is a reality in its own right. In the Metaphysics and in the De Anima, the treatise on the soul, Aristotle really expands on this further and says things he doesn't say here that are really helpful. And the basic idea is that, first of all, we have sensations, and sensations are movements which our bodies undergo because they are in proximity and contact with other bodies that we sense, right? So sensation is a kind of bodily process. And then there's a kind of spiritual or psychical or psychological aspect of sensation, which is imagination. And imagination is kind of how we connect our sensations together, how we make sense of them, and how they kind of continue in us from one instant to another. And so imagination is already quite like memory. But for Aristotle, our sensation of time emerges only from the emergence of memory. So we have to have sensations. You have to have these actual physical instances in which our body is affected by other bodies. And then we have memory come and, take our past memories and give them to us again in a later present, as memory does. And it's only from this sense of the past and the present simultaneously in our soul that the experience of time can emerge.
That time either does not exist at all, or does so scarcely, or in a vague way, might be suspected on the basis of the following considerations. One part of time has been and is not, while another part of it will be and is not yet. And from these, both unlimited time and whatever time is taken on any given occasion are composed. What is composed of non-beings, however, might seem to be incapable of participating in being.
Okay, I'm going to have to stop again there because he's already said so much. We were looking at this vague sense in which time scarcely exists. And the way that this appears, first of all, is that the past and future are necessary parts of our experience of time, and yet these parts do not seem to exist. The one no longer is, and the one is not yet. So, in a way, Aristotle's already telling us his view when he says, and from these, both unlimited time and whatever time is taken on any given occasion are composed. What he's saying is that time is always composed, whether it is, as he says, unlimited time or time taken on any given occasion. These two, unlimited time and any given occasion, map out a later distinction between a perceptual sense of time that animals have and the kind of time that we experience through the intellect. Any given occasion ends up being more like a calendar date, while unlimited time is something that we experience in the perception of movement and is unique to every movement that we perceive. And later he refers to this as that thing, whatever it is, by being which movement is what it is. And this points to what I would call an original temporality that is prior to our experience of time. It's prior to our conception and intellection of time. And so, basically, time for Aristotle is this emergent form which follows on a sort of more unlimited form where every perception we have of movement has its own measure of time within it. So every perception of movement involves a unique time, and there's no sort of global universal time. So while Aristotle starts out with this paradox of whether time exists or not, in the end, he retains a paradoxical sense of time, but not with respect to that exoteric problem. Instead, the paradox is with respect to the unlimited time and that from which kind of time, the whatever it is by being which time exists.
In addition, in the case of everything that is divisible into parts, if it is necessary that when it is, either all or some of its parts must be. In the case of time, by contrast, although it is divisible into parts, some parts have been, some parts are to be, but none is. For the now is not a part. For a part is measured, and the whole is composed of parts. But time does not seem to be composed of nows.
Aristotle is now furthering and deepening the difficulties with these exoteric views of time. It's not clear what time is made of, like what sort of things compose time. And Aristotle is introducing a somewhat technical term here, the now, and he will go into a lot more detail later about what it is and what he means by it and the ambiguities related to it. At this point in the treatise, it means something like a moment in time. So a future moment in time, a past moment in time, or the present moment in time. And the word in Greek is to nun, which is the now. So with the article to on there, it's become almost an abstract concept, the now. And Aristotle does think that the now exists. He thinks it's a real attribute of time, but he does not think that time is composed of nows. Obviously, somehow time is related to past and future moments in time, and clearly the moment in time now, which divides time, is somehow an aspect, important aspect of time, but it is not what time is composed of. So Aristotle is going to go on to ask what time is composed of. Is it made of nows? Is it made of limits? Or is it made of movements?
Further, it is not easy to see whether the now, which appears to divide the past from the future, remains one and the same on all occasions, or is a distinct thing on distinct ones. For if it is always a distinct one on a distinct occasion, and if distinct parts in time are not simultaneous unless one encompasses and the other is encompassed, as the shorter time is encompassed by the larger, and if the now that is not but was previously must have passed away at some time, then the nows will not be simultaneous either, and it must always be that the previous now has passed away. Well, it cannot have passed away in itself because it then exists, whereas to have passed away in another now is impossible for a previous now. For we take it that it's impossible for nows to be contiguous to each other, as it is for a point to be contiguous to a point.
Aristotle is referring to certain geometrical intuitions here, axioms, that 2 points cannot touch each other. They can always have an infinite number of more points put between them, since space is infinitely divisible. So a continuity cannot be composed of points, a line cannot be composed of points, and points cannot touch each other.
If indeed then it has not passed away in the next now, but in another one, it will be simultaneously in the nows in between them, which are unlimitedly many. But this is impossible.
Applying this geometrical intuition about lines to time, the problem complexifies. We must notice the change of time by there being multiple nows, a prior now and a later now. When a now passes away and is no longer, it must pass away in another now. It does not pass away in its own now. It is in its own now. And in a later now, it passes away. Both nows would then be in the same now and would be indistinguishable, and in addition to that, an infinite number of nows between them. Time is impossible because there are infinitely many nows, but no way to relate them to each other.
But then it is not possible either for the now to remain the same on all occasions. For nothing that is divisible and limited has only one limit, whether it is continuous in one direction or in more than one. But the now is a limit, and it is possible to take a limited time. Furthermore, if to be together with respect to time, and neither before nor after, is to be at one and the same now, and if earlier and later nows are at this very now, then events of 10,000 years ago will be simultaneous with events of today, and nothing will be either before or after anything else. So much, then, by way of going through the puzzles concerning the things that belong to time. As to what time is, and what its nature is, what is left equally unclear both by what has been handed down to us and by our previous discussions, some say that it is movement of the whole universe, others that it is the sphere itself. And yet, a part of the revolution of the universe is also a time, but a revolution it certainly is not. For what was taken was a part of a revolution, not a revolution. Further, if there were more than one heaven, the movement of any whatsoever would equally be time, so that many distinct times would be together. The sphere of the whole universe was believed to be time by those who said it was, because everything is both in time and in the sphere of the whole universe. But this view is too simple minded for us to investigate its impossible consequences.
Aristotle has now claimed that time is not unreal, but at the same time, all of the aspects of time that people had previously understood, things like the now and things like the movement of the heavens, cannot be explanations of time. So these views of time, the exoteric one about its impossibility, and this sort of cosmological, astronomical view, both involve certain true ideas about time, but just do so in a confused way, as we'll see.
But since time seems most of all to be a sort of movement and change, this we must investigate. Now, the change and movement of a given thing is only in the thing that is changing, or whatever the thing itself that is moving and changing happens to be. Time, by contrast, is present equally everywhere and where everything is. Further, change is faster or slower, whereas time is not. For the fast and slow are defined by time. Fast being what moves much in little time, slow what moves little in much time. Time, though, is not defined by time, neither by its being so much nor by its being of a certain sort. It is evident, therefore, that time is not a movement, and it makes no difference to us at present whether we speak of movement or of change. But then neither does time exist without change. For when we ourselves do not change in our thoughts or do not notice that we have changed, then it does not seem to us that time has passed, just as it does not seem to have done so to the fabled sleepers among the heroes in Sardinia when they wake up. The footnote is helpful here. The fabled sleepers among the heroes in Sardinia. Hero cults were common in ancient Greece, since heroes, a bit like Christian saints, were conceived of as beings with a special status, intermediate between gods and ordinary human beings. According to one account, sick people received a treatment in Sardinia that involved sleeping among the heroes for 5 days, after which they awoke remembering nothing. For they join together the earlier now to the later now and make them one, omitting what is in between because of lack of perception. So, just as if the now were not distinct, but one and the same, there would not have been time in the same way when it is distinct but is not noticed to be distinct. What is in between does not seem to be a time. If then our not thinking that there is time happens to us when we do not distinguish any change whatsoever, but rather the soul seems to remain in one indivisible now, and that when we perceive and distinguish, when we say that there is time, it is evident that time does not exist without movement and change.
So, time is the awareness of change, and that means that it is awareness. It's something that happens in our awareness. And if the now is the same in our awareness, if we can't see the now as different, then time will not exist. So we have to see the now as different in order to experience time. We only experience time when we differentiate between a before and after. Aristotle has officially now come out and said it. Time is a product of the soul's perceptual and intellectual capacities. The mind both connects and distinguishes, both making continuous and dividing. And in the same exact way that the mind acts is the way that a point is. And so we see this analogy come up again and again throughout these passages in order to explain the ambiguity and duplicity of both the mind's activity of the now and of points in geometry. The mind is indivisible and dividing. This comes up in Aristotle's De Anima, Book 3, chapters 4 through 6. A point can divide a line, but it also is continuous with that line. It's on that line. And so the mind too is both continuous and dividing. The mind both gathers up and separates our perceptions and our memories, and these dual aspects are reflected in the multiplicity and unity we experience in time. One other thing, I am always curious about the details in Aristotle's examples and metaphors. Why this mythical spiritualist example of the sleepers at Sardinia? This points to a sort of esoteric meaning of time. Time as not merely the product of measurement, a quantity, but also the experience of being able to distinguish that change has taken place, something existing in the soul as we experience. This points to a possible experience that is non-temporal. This experience is actually not experience, but the existence of the soul without experience. Again in De Anima, this time Book 2, Chapter 1, this sort of existence of the soul is called first actuality, first entelikeia. It is the enduring of the soul in an inactive state. It's the soul which is evident in sleep, inactive, enduring soul. It's a kind of eternal now, which I would not call a present, since the present is conceived as distinct from the past and the future. But the eternal now is not present at all, nor is it something present to consciousness. It cannot be present to itself and be experienced. This first actuality of sleep does not distinguish between any moments, so it cannot be a time that we actually experience.
It is evident, then, that time neither is movement, nor does it exist without movement. And since we are inquiring into what time is, we must start from this, and ask what thing belonging to movement
It is.
For we do not perceive movement and time together. For even when it is dark, and nothing affects us through the body, but there is some movement in the soul, it immediately seems to us that some time has passed. Moreover, when some time seems to have passed, some movement also seems to have occurred together with it. So time is either movement or something belonging to movement. Since then it is not movement, it must be something belonging to or of movement.
The translator inserts the word belonging here, and I think it's better to just keep this in the literal kind of ambiguity in the Greek, which we find with the word of. So he says that time must be something of movement. This can mean a lot of different things, and Aristotle analyzes the different meanings of in the Metaphysics, which I have up here. And it can really mean a lot of different things, from being of something, like a statue is made of bronze, so referring to the matter, or it can be that some action or event happened of something, so because it was caused by that thing's action, because of some movement or some action. It can also be from, in the sense of something happened from something else because it happened after it. So Aristotle says that there's also a temporal sense of, where something follows after. Spring is of or from winter. He explains how time is of movement in the passage that immediately follows.
Since what moves from something to something. However, and since every magnitude is continuous, the movement follows along with the magnitude. For because the magnitude is continuous, the movement is continuous too, and because the movement is, the time is.
The fact that time follows movement means that time adopts certain attributes and determinations from movement. It adopts some of its being and some of its reality, but it also becomes something different. And this is what I meant by emergence earlier. So, time has a dependency on movement, but it also goes beyond that movement. It surpasses it. It introduces something new that exists in its own right and is not movement.
For whatever the length of the movement is, that always seems to be the length of the time that has passed as well. Accordingly, the before and after is primarily in place, and there it is in their position. Since, though, the before and after is in the magnitude, it is necessary that the before and the after is also in the movement, by analogy, with the ones there. But then in time too, the before and after is present, because of the one always following along with the other of them. Now, the before and after in movement is that thing, whatever it is, by being which motion is, i.e., is what it is. But the being for it is distinct and not a movement.
We should stop and discuss quick what Aristotle means by before and after. This spatial sense of before and after is simply something being in front of or behind something. But in Aristotle's cosmos, this is never random, or it's not random for the most part. The sun rises in the east and sets in the west. The world is kind of oriented by certain relations of before and after, as well as higher and lower. Before and after can also have a kind of logical or causal relation. A cause comes before the effect. And certain causes are primary for Aristotle, and this primacy, this primariness, adds a lot more conceptual ambiguity to the terms. He discusses this in Book 5 of the Metaphysics, Chapter 11.
Among things said to be prior and posterior, some are so said on the supposition that there is a first and a starting point in each genus, because they are closer to a certain starting point defined either unconditionally and by nature, or with reference to something or somewhere, or by certain people. For example, things are prior in place by being closer to some place defined either by nature, for example, the middle or the last place, or with reference to something chance and random, and what is further away is posterior. Other things are prior in time, some by being further from now, as in the case of things that have come to be. The Trojan War are prior to the Persian, because they are further from now. Some by being closer to now, as in the case of some things that are to come. The Numian Games are prior to the Pythian, because they are closer to now, treating now as a starting point and first. Others are prior in movement, for what is closer to the first mover is prior. For example, the boy is prior to the man. And the first mover is unconditionally a sort of starting point. Others are prior in capacity, for what is superior in capacity, that is, what is more capable, is prior. Others are prior in order, when there is some one definite thing relative to which things are arranged at intervals in accord with some account. For example, in a chorus, the second person is prior to the third. In the lyre, the next to the bottom string to the bottom one. Since in the one case, the chorus leader is the other, the middle string is the starting point. These things then are said to be prior in this way.
But then again, we come to know time when we distinguish movement, defining it by the before and after. And we say that time has passed when we get a perception of the before and after in movement. And we define it by grasping one, now, and then another, and something else in between them. For whenever we understand the extremes to be distinct from what is intermediate, and the soul says that the nows are two, one earlier and the other later, it is then, and it is this, that we say time is.
Time emerges basically by putting together things that are not time but that are very similar to time and that are sort of ingredients in time. Namely, the quality of having a before and after, which is in movement, and the limit or the outer exterior, which is characteristic of limit and the measure and the form and the exterior of things.
For what is given definition by the now is believed to be time, and we may assume this. Whenever we perceive the now as one and not either as before and after in the movement or as the same but belonging to something that is before and after, no time seems to have passed because there seems to have been no movement either. But whenever we do perceive the before and after, then we say that there is time. For time is just this, a number of change with respect to before and after. Time is therefore not movement, but rather movement insofar as it has number. A sign of this is the fact that we discern more and less by number, but more or less movement by time. Time is therefore a sort of number. Since, though, number is twofold, what is counted and what is countable, what we count them with are called number. Time is, of course, what is counted and not what we count by. And what we count by is distinct from what is counted.
The distinction being made here is that between number, properly speaking, that by which we count, and what is counted, things and movements. What is counted or capable of being counted is different than that by which we count, and time is what lends itself to being counted.
Also, just as movement is always distinct on every occasion, so too is time. But all simultaneous time is the same. For the now, whichever now it is the same, though the being for it is distinct. And the now measures time insofar as it is before and after. The now, though, is in a way the same and in a way not the same. For insofar as it occasions on different occasions, it is distinct. This is what it is for it to be the now. Whereas that, whatever it is, by being which the now is, i.e., is what it is the same. For, as we said, movement follows along with magnitude, and time follows along with movement, as we are saying here. And as in the case of the point, so in the case of the thing in spatial movement, by which we come to know movement and the before and after in it, and what is in spatial movement, in respect of that thing, whatever it is, by being which it is, what it is the same, whether a point, a stone, or something else of this sort. But in account it is distinct, just as the sophists take Corsicus in the Lyceum and Corsicus in the marketplace to be distinct. What is in spatial movement, then, is distinct by being in distinct places, and the now follows along with what is in spatial movement, just as the time does with the movement. For it is what is in spatial movement that we know the before and after in movement, and the before and after insofar as it is countable in the now. So, in this case, too, that thing, whatever it is, by being which the now is, what it is the same, since it is the before and after in movement, although the being for it is different, since insofar as it is countable, it is the now. And it is this that is most knowable, For the movement too is known by what is moving, and spatial movement by what is in spatial movement. For what is in spatial movement is this something, whereas the movement is not. In one way, then, the now is always the same, and another, not the same. For what is in spatial movement is so too. It is evident too that if time did not exist, the now would not, and if the now did not, time would not. For just as what is in spatial movement and is spatial movement are together. For just as what is in spatial movement and its spatial movement are together, so too are the number of what is in spatial movement and its spatial movement. For the number of the spatial movement is time, while the now corresponds to what is in spatial movement as a sort of unit of number. Also, time is both continuous by virtue of the now and divided at the now. For this too follows along with the spatial movement and what is in spatial movement. For the movement, that is, the spatial movement, is one by virtue of what it is in spatial movement, because it is one, and not because that thing, whatever it is, by being which it is what it is one. Since that might leave intervals, but rather because it is one in account. And this is what gives definition to the movement as before and after. In this respect, too, the now follows along in a way with the point, for the point also makes the length continuous and gives it definition, since it is the start of one length and the end of another. But when one takes it in this way, treating the one point as two, one must come to a stop if the same point is going to be start and end. The now, on the other hand, because what is in spatial movement is in movement, is always a distinct one. So, time is a number, not as being the number of the same point, because it is both start and end, but more as the extremes are the number of the line, and not as the parts are, both because of what we said before, for we can treat the middle points as two, so that being at rest will result. And furthermore, because it is evident that the now is no part of time, nor the division a part of the movement, any more than the point is a part of a line. On the contrary, it is the two lines that are parts of the one line. Insofar as the now is a limit, then it is not time, but rather a coincident of it, an attribute. Whereas, insofar as it counts, it is a number. For limits belong only to what they are the limits of, whereas the number of these horses, 10, is elsewhere too.
Aristotle is saying that each now is unique. The moments that bind time, the before and the after, the beginning and the end of a period of time, those binding points, those limits, are concretely connected to what they limit. If you take a snowball inside from outside in the winter, there's the time that you come into the house, and then there's the time that it takes for the snowball to melt. Its limits are drawn by the nature of the things in question, the snow and the temperature of the room. Time is not a universal number or counted by number in some universal way. Number in this sense refers to the concrete quality of having durational multiplicity, multiplying and extending in duration. Time derives its irreversible quality from this aspect of movement. Movement is a durational multiplicity, and time gains this from it. Therefore, the now, in one of its main senses, is something different in every case, which means there are an infinity of possible and an innumerable number of actual nows which we experience. Every now measures an event in the concrete movements and changes of the universe and our lives.
It is evident, therefore, that time is a number of movement with respect to the before and after, and that it is continuous, since what it is of is continuous.